I wanted to take this opportunity to go through what took me 3 to 4 months this past summer to provide reinforcement via metal fabrication to a number of parts in the chassis that are required for an LS swap. Firstly, you have, as a first order of business on a classic 911, 912, one must reinforce the shock towers. There are reports, and there is a history when you're going to coilovers, that the shock towers can tear only because they weren't designed to carry the stress of the entire load of the rear end of the car. So this is Elephant Racing's shock tower that reinforcement kit that I welded in here. This is the side of the engine bay. There are some small flux-core welds here. I didn't have my MIG welder by then, but after this work was done, I pulled the trigger on a pretty good MIG welder, which is gas shielded. Flux-core is just, there's flux in the center of the wire. So on both sides, same thing, just repeat. Welded in these two washers in the top of the shock tower quite strongly here with a couple stringer beads. Whenever you need to provide additional strength when you're welding, you can run several beads. Here I have, from not Elephant's Racing Kit, but my own work, use of 14 gauge sheet steel that was welded in over the top. This is a piece that was about an inch wide over the top of the chassis here that came down, and I ran a welding bead here. Welding beads through here. You have to coat the cross member here, right where it meets the longitudinal main here. You need to coat both of these large chassis pieces with preferably 14 gauge sheet metal. 1/8 inch is the next greater thickness for sheet metal. It's too thick to bend, but 14. Actually, I stand corrected, this is 16 gauge. This is 14 gauge here. Now, what is this? This is entirely custom, which I fabricated out of 14 gauge sheet steel on the top. And these two plates are 3/16 inch low carbon plate steel. I drilled the top of this plate. It's essentially is about a 3-inch wide. You start with a 3-inch wide piece of 1/8 inch plate sheet steel, and then bend it like a U, and then on the bottom it bends down this way here a little bit. So it's kind of like a U or a C here, wrapped over the top. First drilled with 8 or 9 holes for plug welds. You can see the plug welds filled there. They're also called rosette welds. Then what you do is run a single bead along this edge, along the back edge, then along this edge here, down both sides, down here. These are MIG, so they're very smooth. Then you weld your plates in, and you run a bead on both sides of the plate. Drill a 1/2 inch hole because I'm using some mounts that have a DOM with a urethane shock mount in it. So this is serving as a secondary engine mount for the LS, the Renegade Hybrid's custom cradle, which bolts to standby, which bolts to this rod, for which the rod end. This is a DOM tube, is what it's called in axle and shaft mounts. These are 2 urethane bushings, and this is a 1/2 inch bolt. So these 2 holes in these 2 plates are a 1/2 inch. Then you run this bolt gets fastened through there. The 2 urethane bushings are fitted, slide in nicely between these 2. This hangs down to the custom cradle, which bolts into the mount of the LS engine. So this is an additional mount that I'd never seen before. I wanted to add this and perform this fabrication to provide additional support for the LS engine because it just has so much torque. at least with regard to what was previously in this car, i.e. a 4-cylinder, 90 horsepower, 1600 cc Porsche engine. As you're aware, in this area you had the original donut-shaped mount right here for the 912 engine that was ground off and removed. If you recall, on a 912 that it doesn't require the rear engine mounts that 911s do. But 912s have a single piece of about 14 gauge plate sheet steel here, chassis plate, which is kind of flimsy, so I doubled up on some 14 gauge, cut out 2 pieces of 14 gauge, drilled 72 millimeter holes in both of them, and then bent the top piece in a vise and then a bottom piece in a vise, welded the two together here before it was installed in the car with another piece of 14 inch, about a ½ inch wide and 5-6 inches long. On the bench I ground in 5 or 6 plug holes in the mount here, 5 or 6 plug holes on the top, welded those plug holes. Initially I thought that was adequate or enough, and typically in an original 911 that has the rear mounts here in a classic 60s and 70s, you're only going to have a small number of welds here. You're not going to have long beads in this area. So I ran one continuous bead here, as you can see. So a long bead there, a long bead here, filling this up, a long bead on the back end here. Repeat on the bottom. So this is really not going anywhere. It's very sturdy, and the combination of both of these pieces that are just shy of 1/8 of an inch is approximately 3/16 of an inch. So this overall, acting together, these two sheets on top and bottom act like about a 3/16 thick piece of low carbon steel. So in addition to this mount, which is commonly what, if people are going to do if you're going to do an LS swap in a vintage 912, 911, especially with a 911, you will have these 72 millimeter holes here in an OEM engine mount in a vintage 912, obviously with a flat 6 in it. Or a Carrera or a 930. Same mount through all those years here. If you question whether this isn't going to be enough for your LS swap, you might want to do something like this, to have an additional mount here that provides a rod, or 2 rod ends with urethane bushings that you bolt in here, and then you weld in tabs on your custom cradle that you get from Renegade Hybrids. So overall, not too much. It's not rocket science, just standard, straightforward metal fabrication and a little welding. I happen to have been a welder in the auto industry in Detroit in the summertime during undergrad. So welding for me is like riding a bike. I just don't. One of the modes that I don't do is TIG. I do MIG, flux-core, and stick, and aluminum as well.